Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to be on behalf of the organizing committee to welcome you to a new lecture of the Leipzig lectures on language. We started last May with a lineup of 9 fantastic tandems from different universities and research directions, which we list again on the welcome slide. The goal of the series is to provide answers to questions such as, what information do we combine in language? Is this process domain specific or domain general? How does the brain process combinatorics in language? And how does it take place during language acquisition? What kind of empirical methods can further or can bring us further? And how can theory influence experimental linguistics and vice versa? So our goal is to wrap up answers, suggestions, and ideas from our invited speakers in the form of a symposium, which will take place in October this year, and which will center on 4 hands-on workshops on experimental approaches to language research. You can follow our updates on our Twitter account at Frederici Lab, and you can join our newsletter and check our website on the Max Planck platform. I can see that many people have already joined us on YouTube and Zoom, so it's my real pleasure to welcome the 7th tandem of the Leipzig lectures on language. So it's Stephan Meylan and Roger Levy who will give the talk entitled The Nature and Origins of Grammatical Productivity. First, I can give you some information on the speakers of today. So Stephan Meylan is a postdoctoral fellow in the Computational Psycholinguistics Lab in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, and a postdoctoral associate in the Bergelsen Lab in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. He studies the relationship of language processing and language development with a focus on the emergence of combinatorial morphosyntax, using a combination of computational models, corpus studies, and in-lab experiments. Roger Levy is an associate professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science, also at MIT. His research focuses on theoretical and applied questions in the processing and acquisition of natural language, employing computational modeling, psycholinguistic experimentation, and analysis of large naturalistic language datasets. As usual, the talk should have the form of 10 to 15 minutes presentation by the senior researcher and 30 minutes talk by the junior researcher. After that, we will have space for a few questions to be asked to the invited speakers. Before starting the talk, just some more additional information. Please keep your microphone muted, and you can post your questions anytime in the YouTube or Zoom chat. Preface your questions with Q or with QJ if you are a junior researcher, as we will give them priority. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag LeipzigLang21, and we might need to filter the questions in case we get too many. And to increase the interaction, we like to invite people actually who post their question on Zoom, then to turn on the microphone and ask the question themselves when they will be called. We are also offering live captioning. I think this is enough from my side, so please welcome Stephan Meylan and Roger Levy. So Roger, the stage is yours and you can share your slides now.
Thank you so much. Here we go. I want to thank, while I'm getting I want to thank Gesa and all of the organizers for this series. This is really a pleasure for us, and I'm delighted to be able to present a little bit of our work and also to have discussion. And looking forward to all aspects of this event over a period of many weeks. So what I'm going to do is just spend a couple of minutes quickly outlining the general research orientation that our group takes to the problems that are under discussion today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stefan for a detailed case study in the context of this broader research program. So the broad research program we work on tries to investigate and to some of the most fundamental questions about language in the human mind. What is the character of linguistic knowledge and how does it emerge? So if we look at languages across the world, and of course, languages, whether or not you happen to have an intrinsic love or knowledge of language, if you're interested in human minds at all, you should be interested in it, because language is a uniquely rich and available, measurable, identifiable, introspectable window into the nature of the human mind. But languages vary dramatically across the world in their structure. So, for example, a simple example of this would be, let's take a sentence like English. I bought the bed. If I turn that into another language, express the same meaning, you would get very big changes in the form. So for example, if I move it to Japanese, I get something like bed to okatta. So you'll notice, for example, that the word order is different and that the subject is not overtly expressed. It can be just left out and inferred. And we can go to another language, for example, Oneida, which is an American Indian language. And here, the entire sentence proposition would be expressed in a single word, wa kenakta ninu. While there are these dramatic differences, at the same time, there are also strong and perhaps universal generalizations about language structure. So, for example, languages seem to, by and large, have basic inventories of grammatical categories that are similar to each other. Language has the relations of words in a sentence are phrasal, and there's headship and hierarchy. And there's also semantic compositionality, but also idiosyncrasy. So, for example, if I say kick the ball, I can understand the meaning of that as a composition of the meanings of kick and ball. But kick the bucket in English means to die, and I would just have to know that that's an idiosyncratic property of this phrase. And so our fundamental research program tries to see these, look at these facts and ask some general questions like through what mechanisms does linguistic knowledge emerge? And then also, of course, this is an era of data, and I think that one of the exciting things about where science of language is going is that we're able to bring the theories and the data in closer and closer contact by being computationally explicit about what the theory is mechanistically, and then relate it to data by building it as a predictive framework that we can implement computationally and then interface with data. And so that answers to our theoretical questions ideally should pop out as transparent consequences of applying models to data. And you're going to see this throughout today's talk. One thing that is especially important, and this is maybe you can think of as the focus of today's talk, is that linguistic knowledge, first of all, is rich and it involves multiple levels of structure. And at every level of structure, it involves what we can think of as both familiar and novel linguistic content. So for example, in the area of phonology, in English, we're familiar with this, and Stefan is going to talk about it. There's a pluralization rule, which says that, for example, and it allows me to take a novel word that I've never heard before, dax, and turn it into a plural form, daxes, and I can predict the form of that plural. I can do it likewise with another word like blick, change it to blicks, which is a different phonological form, but it's the same rule. Likewise, trick and tricks related. This is a familiar form that follows the rule, but there are also familiar forms that don't follow the rule, like goose is pluralized to geese. This also is true at the level of syntax. So for example, a mouse and the mouse are interchangeable. A flu and the flu are also sort of interchangeable, but there's also an idiosyncrasy where I like to say the flu more than a flu, whereas I would say a cold rather than the cold. I can also apply the productive knowledge to novel words. So if I hear that if I learn a word tufa, I can actually convert, and I hear it in the context of a tufa, I know that I should be able to say that tufa. And we also will see this in other kinds of syntax, for example, like the word order ordering characteristic that I can take two words and conjoin them in either word. So just very briefly, this is sort of the big picture. I want to very quickly outline two case studies in service of the broader mission. The broader mission is that we want to build, as I said, as a cognitively interpretable hypothesis space for language learning and knowledge that is embedded ultimately in a model for statistical data analysis about language users and language learners. So it's going to look something along these lines that the big theory is that, well, languages are constrained in their variation, and the constraint has to do at least partly with acquisition mechanisms, which you see in the upper right, but also language outcomes in terms of what you wind up learning depend on the input. But languages are different around the world, and so you have the influence of input in the upper left. Those two things come together to lead to knowledge of the developing language learner and the adult native speaker user. And we can actually then gain inferences about that knowledge by looking at the relationship between input and also data. And that you can think of as the enterprise of the study of language. And we're trying to formalize that and make it more and more computationally precise and interfaceable with data. And so it should also be applicable to both experimental and naturalistic data. And we'll see that today. One big consequence of this idea is that there's a notion of sort of both productive language processes and also knowledge, once again, that has to be just sort of learned and remembered. And the boundary of that turns out to be very interesting. And we're going to be, throughout today, we're going to see that. And we can think of that as something like the edge of the lexicon, where the lexicon is a stored repertoire of facts above and beyond the sort of the grammatical rule type generalizations. And one thing that will turn out to a big consequence of the framework that we're going to take is that language users and language learners are rational. They make optimal use of the available resources. And this has a very strong implication, which is that when I have a repertoire of experiences with specific items in my mind, the way that I treat those items in the future should depend on how much experience I have with those things. So, so when I have, for words for items that I haven't had much experience with, I need to rely on what you can think of as generative or productive knowledge. And in the extreme case, if I have no experience with something, then productive knowledge is all I have to rely on. But as an item becomes more and more frequent, it makes more and more sense in the mind to store specific information about it, because that item is more and more likely to be used again. So we're interested in the questions of what are the role of these productive knowledge and direct item-specific experience components in language processing, and under the assumptions that language has compositional structure and idiosyncrasies, and people have finite language experience. So we're always generalizing. And we predict this gradient trade-off as a function of direct experience, and we should see this in processing, acquisition, and the structure of the lexicon, including lexicon writ broadly, multi-word expressions, anything that you might actually store experience with respect to. Extremely briefly, I'll just note, sort of in the broader past context, to set up Stefan's talk, 2 case studies that have informed and sort of exemplify the way we treat these problems in our own research. One is characterizing adult knowledge of multi-word expressions, in particular, multi-word expressions called binomials. This is a former student of mine, Emily Morgan, now at UC Davis, and then also work that Stefan led in earlier years on the childhood emergence of rule-based syntactic knowledge. So the first case study is about binomials. And I think this will be very easy to illustrate. So I want you to just answer the following question in your mind. So you've probably never seen either of these word sequences before in English: seamstresses and bishops, or bishops and seamstresses. Well, what I'd like you to think about is, well, if you had to choose one of the 2 orderings, which ordering sounds better? Which do you think you would choose? Which do you think you would use at the moment, if you had to say this? Most people, if this was a real-time participatory back and forth channel, I would be polling the audience, but I can tell you that most of you are probably thinking bishops and seamstresses, about 70-30 preference for that. Even though neither of these expressions exists probably in your lifetime of linguistic experience. And it turns out there are many reasons for this. So for example, these are things that we've studied before in terms of the factors that influence ordering preferences, both for familiar and novel words. So you might prefer it because bishops are sort of a stereotypically more powerful or central kind of entity than seamstresses. Bishops is a shorter word than seamstresses. Bishops is a more frequent word than seamstresses. And bishops has sort of, this ordering has some preferable phonological properties. Now I'm going to give you another example. What about this? Meat and potatoes, or potatoes and meat? Which would you choose? This is probably really easy for you to decide. You would choose meat and potatoes. Now let's look at the reasons if we look at the underlying productive factors that drive this preference. So you might prefer this because meat is sort of, in the context of dishes, more culturally more powerful and central than potatoes, which are sort of the side. Meat is a shorter word than potatoes. Meat is a more frequent word than potatoes, and meat also has, this ordering also has these preferable phonological properties. But you probably also had the experience that your preference for meat and potatoes over potatoes and meat is much stronger than the preference for bishops and seamstresses over seamstresses and bishops, even though these are exactly the same considerations that are involved. There's another factor that I haven't mentioned yet, which is that you've heard meat and potatoes a lot. You've heard it a lot more than potatoes and meat. The corpus frequency is about 95% at least. And so what this exemplifies is the simultaneous role of direct frequency and direct experience, and also these productive pressures. And these are cases that involve productivity, but also a rich history of experience. So binomial expressions exist in many orders of magnitude of frequency of experience. So we can actually, they're a wonderful petri dish for studying these kinds of influences in preferences. And so we can study the relationship actually in this kind of state of how direct experience with particular expression also more productive knowledge. And I want to remind you of this theoretical prediction that we make, which is at a trade-off, that for more frequent expressions, we're going to more rely on the direct experience that we have with them. And so our preferences, in cases where the direct experience and the productive pressures happen to misalign, the more frequent the expression, the more we should go with the direct experience. And the less frequent the expression, the more we should rely on generative or productive knowledge. And so you can do this in a controlled experiment, and Emily did this. First of all, we build a model, a very simple model using logistic regression that takes a bunch of features that we have established, influenced by binomial ordering preferences, turn it into a model that defines what we could call a generative productive preference. We can quantify corpus evidence for each of these predictors, and we can look at fit. And the fit is the fit to empirical corpus data is good, but there's a lot of scatter. And a lot of the scatter actually has to do with the fact that there are idiosyncratic preferences for these items. Now let's look at the role of those idiosyncratic preferences. So we can take these ordering preferences, embedding them in a sentence, and have the same experiment that I just described to you and ran on you, and I can do this with experimental participants. And what we find is when we do this, so if we look at the generative or productive knowledge preference, that is what the factors that would influence our preferences for new items, if we plot that on the x-axis and plot that on the y-axis, and on the y-axis, we plot the direct experience. And we look at expressions that are lower in overall frequency versus higher overall frequency. So for example, women and men and women would be a very high frequency expression. An expression like directness and truth versus truth and directness is a low frequency expression, just you have less overall experience with it. And now the result that we find, the shading indicates basically how strongly people prefer a particular ordering. And what I want you to see is that the gradient, the influence, light to dark, is more or less horizontal for low frequency items. That is that the productive generative knowledge matters the most. And then it becomes diagonal and then vertical, the gradient, as you move to higher expression frequency. So as you move from low frequency to higher frequency, it's direct experience that matters more and more, and generative, the productive knowledge preferences that matter less and less. And so that's an evidence of the trade-off that we just predicted. Okay, and you can see we find these results statistically significant in an analysis. Now let me just briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Stefan, describe the second case study, which has to do with the emergence of rule-based syntactic knowledge in learners. This has to do with the case study of how determiners and nouns combine. And to characterize, now we're interested in characterizing the developmental trajectory. How does an adult-like knowledge state emerge? And first, we have to describe the adult knowledge state. So an adult native speaker, for example, knows some abstractions that we can describe using the grammatical categories of linguistic theory, like that A and the are the same lexical category, and that this category can freely combine with nouns, as we depicted above in the little rule. And this implies some interchangeability. So for example, if you can say a mouse, then you say then the mouse is fine. But once again, you can also see that there are idiosyncrasies, and that those are also things that adult native speakers know. So for flu, the flu is preferred over a flu. Once again, you can productively go from tufa to the tufa, and that's reliance on productive knowledge. And we're interested in the developmental trajectory of this productivity. So this is Stefan's prior work in the 2017 psychological science paper. And we can sort of state in the literature before, there have been sort of two extreme positions that have been articulated. One is what you can describe as sort of a rule-based learner, where from the very earliest moments of multi-word expressions, the child is being governed by what we could describe as adult-like syntactic rules, like a noun phrase can be composed of a determiner and a noun, then you list the determiners, then you list the nouns, and so forth. And you could turn this into a model that makes quantitative predictions regarding corpus frequencies by making it a probabilistic grammar and putting probabilities on the rules. And the hypothesis underlying the rule-driven child is that this productive knowledge emerges very early and guides child understanding and speech. And so researchers like Virginia Bailey and Charles Young have been proponents of this position. And on the other hand, we have the position of the item-driven child, where it's a very different view. And the view is that it's actually early on, it's not syntactic rules that are guiding child language use. It's actually something more along the following lines. The child is awash in an ocean of input. And from that ocean of input, they have sort of islands of what they learn. And so they can establish these islands. but that's on a very item bit-driven basis. And so in this case, for example, for the noun ball, I might have learned both that and the are items that exist in English, but I haven't actually figured that out for doggy. For doggy, I've only got the, not . And that would imply that I would have a much sparser, as a child, that's my knowledge state. My use of nouns with determiners would be much sparser. There would be holes in that distribution. And that view has been that productive knowledge emerges gradually from multi-word items. We can call those islands. Researchers like Michael Tomasello, Elaine and Julian Pine are people who are associated with that view. What we want to do is interpolate continuously between these two hypothesis spaces. And so what we want to do is we want to define a continuum hypothesis, which we'll define as a parameter of sort of a productivity level, which we'll call nu. And on one pole will be the item-driven knowledge state, and on the other pole will be the rule-driven knowledge state. And we're interested in the developmental trajectory of how this emerges over time. And so it could be gradual and consistent increase in productivity. It could be early and immediately emerging productivity. It could be early over generalization. It could be all sorts of things. And the goal is to build a modeling framework that encapsulates this continuous hypothesis space. And then we apply it to data in order to infer the knowledge state of a child at any one time. And what this looks in practice is we're actually giving teeth computationally to this notion of the relationship between input acquisition mechanisms, knowledge data, knowledge state, and child speech. And we start off with sort of a rational analysis from principles of the rational learner in cognitive science that describes this as sort of a forward model, where the child is reverse engineering. So the child is reverse engineering what would explain the input on the basis of their inductive bias from their acquisition mechanisms. And there is a Bayesian inference that leads to a knowledge state for the child at any one time. But we also, so that's sort of the internal theory that we're building of what the child is doing as a learner. But to apply it to data, we put it in a different direction, and we embed that model in a larger model from which we infer the child's knowledge state as researchers from the child's speech data and from the input. And as a side product, we actually gain inferences about the acquisition mechanisms. Okay, and so we actually do this in practice. We have a computational model for this that integrates both direct experience and productive knowledge components. And we can formalize this using terms. You can actually wug test this. So for example, this productivity parameter to the left is less productive knowledge state, to the right is more productive state. And we can see the different kinds. We can imagine, for example, if the child has input, which is very different frequencies of a ball versus the ball versus a bath versus the bath, but the child actually might overgeneralize. They only use one for every one alternate option for every one of the inputs. This model leads to a generalization of a very unproductive child, very much an island type learner. On the other hand, we can also, for example, wug test the model. And so suppose the child has only ever been exposed to a DAX, but then you hear the child say the DAX. If you run this through the model, then it's smoking gun evidence that the child is actually quite highly productive. So you can apply this both on naturalistic and experimental data. And we've done this with large longitudinal data sets from the childless corpus and others. And we do sliding window analyses to try to infer developmental trajectory, as well as like split half analyses to compare sort of early versus late moments and see if the child is changing in their productivity. And when we do this in the split half analyses, we see that the children for whom we have data the earliest seem to increase over time in grammatical productivity, and the children who we have data from later on in time seem to actually do nothing or do the opposite. And when we plot this out very in an exploratory tentative way, it looks like there's a very early on increase in grammatical productivity over time, and either a leveling off or even possibly a decline. Although the main conclusion here is that the data are limited, and large amounts of corpus data can still leave us in an uncertain knowledge state about the trajectory of development. And the reason is because corpus data don't give us smoking gun evidence like an experiment does. So the conclusions that I have here that I want to leave you with before I turn it over to Stefan are general framework of thinking and theorizing is that linguistic knowledge includes a continuum of productive and item-specific information. We need to have rich hypothesis space for representing both types of knowledge in language learners and users. And we can use hierarchical probabilistic models to integrate both nativist and constructivist insights, and then these models will interface with data and give us out answers to our theoretical questions. For binomial ordering, we've seen evidence for this rational trade-off that we predicted, a productive and item-specific preferences based on item frequency. And for determiner noun acquisition, what we saw is this very interesting item-driven behavior in the early months of multi-word expressions in child speech, but very early on, very soon after that, we see clear evidence for syntactic productivity. And what I'll now do is turn it over to Stefan, who will apply these principles in an empirical study of acquisition of the English plural. Thanks.
Okay, oops. Sorry, one second. Let me share that again. I forgot to enable audio. Let's see. Okay. So I want to thank everybody for joining today.
Sorry, one second. We see the speaker slides with the notes.
Okay, great. I thought I fixed that, but let's stop that and try that again. You would think after a year and a half, I'd have this down. Okay. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So I want to thank everybody for joining today. And again, I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting us. So following on Roger's introduction and overview section, I want to dive into some specific empirical work with kids. So the work I'll be presenting today emerges out of a joint postdoc where I've been trying to combine Roger's language modeling prowess with Dr. Elika Bergelson's experimental and corpus methods and conducting child language experiments at Duke. So what I'll present today is largely the results of in-lab experiments with 2 to 3-year-olds, but I want to assure you that we are now working on modeling these data as well per this sort of larger framework and effort that Roger described. So following on the determiner learning work that Roger just presented, we started to wonder whether we could apply the determiner productivity model to English plurals in order to measure how grammatical productivity changes over early development. That model-based method that Roger talked about should generalize to a fairly broad range of morphosyntactic phenomena. And the English plural is a case where we have a lot of corpus data, a lot more in fact than determiners. But as we started to look at it, we found that there was this weird seeming paradox in the literature. That is apparent evidence of children producing familiar and even novel plurals before robust comprehension. So in particular, about half of families report that their kids are using plurals for familiar nouns by 22 months. And naturalistic corpora of kids' productions show a similar timeline. But in the same age range, we have a number of negative or largely negative results regarding children's comprehension of the plural in experiments in the lab. In fact, these experiments seem to suggest that English learning kids can't choose the right referent, even for familiar words, on the basis of plurality until 36 months. Now, that long timeline for comprehension seems to fit with children's relatively slow phonological development, especially their ability to detect and discriminate sounds in consonant clusters. So this got us thinking a lot more carefully about what is actually implicated in early morphological productivity, and how growing knowledge of phonology, syntax, and semantics, all of which are implicated in the plural, all interact in early acquisition. Then we started to think through a possible solution to this paradox, a theory where children could infer some of the patterns of combinatorial morphosyntax first, based on syntactic agreement, and then learn the meaning of the plural morpheme and flesh out the robust receptive phonological knowledge necessary to recognize the plural in the speech of others. For the lack of a better term, I'm going to start calling this a structure-first theory of morphosyntax learning. And in fact, we saw something like this happening, at least with respect to meaning, in the determiner learning work that Roger just described. Children almost certainly don't know the meaning, and in particular the pragmatics of definite versus indefinite reference until much later in development. And the reason is that choosing the right determiner requires tracking listener belief states about what is in the common ground of discourse. And we don't think kids have that sort of sophisticated knowledge until much later. Thus, we have evidence in the case of determiners that children are discovering combinatorial morphosyntax, combinatorial morphosyntactic rules of some sort before they develop an adult-like knowledge of when to use each of the determiners. So what if children's acquisition of the English plural shows a similar pattern? I'd like to outline this structure first theory in a bit more detail, and I want to contrast it with what I think is a fair characterization of the received theory of morphosyntax learning, that is early combinatorial language learning. So the idea in structure first morphology learning is that children find enough instances of a structural regularity purely in the linguistic signal. For example, a correspondence of the copular R, some intervening material, and a segment S, which they find holds for some selection of nouns and determiners. They can learn, then they can learn both of these linguistic features. Both the copular R and the plural marker S, seen for this collection of words, are both related to some conventionally communicated property of nouns, that is the grammatical number system, and that they see increasing evidence that this is something worth communicating as a matter of linguistic convention, even if they're still discovering all of the possible manifestations that it might have. Given that their phonology is underdeveloped, then these kids have a bunch of nouns that don't seem to mark the plural. So they have two options. They can either posit a more complex grammar where a grammatical number is marked only for some nouns, or they can work to revise their phonological knowledge and try to discover different manifestations of the plural marker. For example, they could discover that the voiced allomorph of the plural has a different acoustic signature than the voiceless one. And to clarify, I am describing the child in somewhat agentic terms, just to keep this sort of simple and informal. But what I really need to say is that a child learner now has a supervisory signal for this phonological learning problem. Now, this diverges quite substantively from the standard theory of morphology learning, the articulation of which I'll borrow from Michael Ramscar. Under this, children have a correspondence between the meaning of the plural and its phonological marking through association. Now, this is a delightfully simple account, but it has a huge problem if children can't actually detect the phonological distinction, that is the sound distinction, in all of its contexts. If they can't find the plural marker, and again, these are short phonological segments and complex word final clusters of consonants, then there's just not enough evidence for them to make this association. So there's this theoretical argument by which we think the standard theory is problematic, but also these two learning accounts suggest different timelines for children's behaviors. So both theories suggest early production. In the case of structure first learning, kids can reproduce some instances of the plural without even knowing its semantics. I'll talk a little bit more about this case on the next slide. In the case of the standard theory, forming an association between a semantic regularity and the phonological marking allows kids to produce the plural, and in this case, they actually know the semantic distinction. Now, the two hypotheses differ in the order of predicted comprehension. For our structure first learning account, robust comprehension without agreement cues should only come much later because of the protracted learning of the relevant sound distinctions, so the relevant phonological distinctions. But children should be able to use the plural to identify reference before that, as long as there are some available agreement cues. For the standard theory, a learner shouldn't need any support from the syntax. So we should expect to see robust comprehension with or without agreement cues emerging at the same time. There was one note on nomenclature that I wanted to throw in after Roger's talk. So I'm going to use the term production here mostly to refer to kids saying things. Roger was using productivity to refer specifically to generalization. I'll talk a little bit about generalization, but I think I used the term generalization in that case. This has been a challenge in a bunch of our work, is talking about both production, as in language production, and productivity, as in building expectations, using the combinatorial structure of language to build expectations, as well as inform production. So I just wanted to flag that in case there's any confusion there. Okay, so I just made this claim that kids can produce some surface forms of the plural without knowing the meaning. And I want to show that this is actually a problem for a classic study of early morphological productivity, one that Roger just mentioned, which is the WUG task of Burko 1958. So the WUG task is a storybook-based test of generalization, where children are presented with pairs of pages. On the first page, they see a singular novel animate object introduced with a phrase with a novel noun like, "This is a wug." On a second page, they're presented with two of the same novel animate object and prompted to complete the following utterance. "Now there is another one, there are two of them, there are two blank." Now, children's success in this task, that is when they produce wugs, is generally taken as strong evidence of grammatical productivity. The standard logic is that children can only provide the right answer for the prompt if they have a productive rule, productive generalization of how to form the plural. But I want to flag three things about this result. The first point is that these are relatively old kids, between 4 and 7 years old. By contrast, a lot of the debates about verb morphology, as well as what Roger just showed about generalization of a noun category with respect to determiners, focus on children's behavior down to 2 or even 1.5 years of age, as soon as they start producing basically any words. The second point is that kids are very far from systematic in this success. Many provide singulars in response to that second page with the plural prompt, and there's a lot of variability across novel items and across kids. So it's not like there's a robust rule that always applies, even for these older kids. And the third point, and I think this is the most important one, is that this task doesn't actually require an understanding of the meaning of the plural. All that's necessary is a learned correspondence between R and that plural marker, or 2 in the plural marker. That is, a learner could identify that there are two wug is an improbable sequence in the adult language without any knowledge of the actual semantics. And in fact, we know that kids are sensitive to these sort of sequence statistics from very early. So for example, Melanie Soderstrom and colleagues found that even 18-month-olds are sensitive to agreement mismatches for novel nouns, which is exactly this situation. So for our purposes, we want to look at much younger kids, systematically track the properties of the lexical items, that is the words, and we want to be very careful about the information sources that we are providing to these kids, especially these agreement cues. So the specifics of structure first learning are a bit complicated, but I want to zoom out for a second and talk about how this structure first learning account represents a fairly substantive shift in how we might think about early combinatorial language use. So this proposal sort of eschews the assumption of combinatorics, about linguistic combinatorics being about a purely bottom-up composition. That is, it's not the case that kids start with some inventory of smaller units and learn to combine those because they're still in the process of discovering those units. So instead, we're proposing that kids are jointly or iteratively revising hypotheses about the linguistic units, as well as the combinatorial processes in which they participate. And this learning process is going to interleave both generative knowledge of the sort that Roger just described in his section and various kinds of discriminative learning. So the real question then is whether it bears out empirically. Remember that the key prediction here is that kids 24 to 36 months, that is once we're starting to produce the plural, need additional syntactic cues in order to identify the appropriate referent in comprehension tasks. So to summarize the differences between our work and previous work, we're going to look at 24 to 36-month-olds and do the following. We'll test both receptive and expressive knowledge of the plural using eye tracking or gaze tracking in the first case, and a storybook elicitation task in the second. We'll look at children's knowledge on both novel and familiar object words. We're interested both in the generalization behaviors as well as their knowledge of familiar words for exactly the reasons that Roger described. We look at children's knowledge of multiple phonological forms of the regular plural, both a voiced and a voiceless allomorph. This has to do with various complexities about whether it's possible that one of these is harder to learn because of its acoustic properties. Then we're going to add some controls. We'll control for animacy and we'll control for the age of acquisition among familiar words using the word bank database. So as an organizational note, I'm going to present 3 studies today. First, I want to talk about 2 studies without agreement cues, and through those, I'll introduce the 2 tasks. One to test comprehension and one to test children's production. Then I'll talk about a third study where we reintroduce agreement cues. And just to motivate my logic for splitting the talk up this way, I have 2 reasons. First, the first 2 studies are essentially testing whether this production before comprehension pattern, which is implied by the totality of the literature, is robust. The third study, by contrast, tests this prediction that kids are relying on the agreement cues from the larger sentence context. Second, there are some minor methodological differences between the first 2 studies and the third, because COVID has meant that we've needed to run the third one over the internet rather than in the lab. And I don't want to burden you with all the details of those minor changes until I have the basic experiment and analyses on the board. So within each experimental session, children completed an eye-tracking task to assess their receptive knowledge of the plural. For the first two studies, we used slightly different carrier phrases. So in the first study, the carrier phrase included a prepositional phrase that identified the location of the noun. For example, can you find the knops on the couch? We did this for two reasons. First, placing the referent in a defined sort of discretized location, for example, on a couch or in a tree, should help delineate these two sort of groups of reference. Second, the vowel initial prepositional phrase makes the voicing of that plural marker sort of more standard. Otherwise, utterance final voiced plurals are very often devoiced, and it's not clear. It's actually a gradient between the two, and there are all sorts of challenges about interpreting the phonology if we do that. In the second study, we made the carrier phrase as simple as possible, and backgrounds were kept consistently blue on the left and red on the right, with a large black bar in between. So participants were recruited from Durham, North Carolina, and balanced by gender, and we balanced by the number in each 4-month age interval between 24 and 36 months. I'm happy to talk about our data-driven exclusions in a question, but for now, I just want to flag that we exclude participants on a per-task basis, such that we can retain the eye-tracking data if the storybook data was unusable, and vice versa. To give you an example of what this looks like, I'm going to play a video with the eye-tracking feed on the left and a corresponding video feed of the family on the right. The timestamp, the bounding box, and the gaze position in the eye-tracking video are all superimposed in post-processing. And that is to say that we can see that, but the participants can't. And I want to note that this is the second study, so the two sides of the screen have different colors, and the child doesn't hear any verbal prompt in the background.
Can you find the nap? Look at the star.
Okay, let me show some eye tracking results for the first studies, the first two studies. That is, we are measuring, just to remind you, we're measuring comprehension of the plural. So I'll split the timeline by whether the named referent was a singular or a plural. Now, if participants can use this singular plural distinction, which is only encoded in morphology, we expect that their looks to target will go from near chance around 0 milliseconds, the point of disambiguation, to near ceiling in the green interval of interest. The 367 millisecond interval from 0 to the beginning of the interval of interest reflects the minimal time necessary for children in this age range to plan and execute a saccade that could reflect the disambiguating linguistic information. So to validate the setup and as well as the analysis pipeline, we ran 9 adults in the first study and 15 adults in the second study. And indeed, we see precisely this pattern among adults who switch from looking at the two panels basically at chance to near ceiling fixations to the target, that is the thing that's named, in both studies. Note that it takes a little bit longer for adults to do this in study 1, as the slope is a little bit steep, is a little less steep. This is just a good sanity check because they have to pre-process the additional prepositional phrase that follows the noun. Also, we can see that adults look to singular targets slightly faster in study 2. So when the only distinction is the additional processing of that plural morpheme, then it takes a little bit longer. However, when we plot the children between 24 and 36 months, we see a minimal difference from chance. We only see that they are potentially looking at plurals, looking more at plurals than singulars in study 1, but this is consistent with their preference before hearing the linguistic stimuli. That is, they might simply reflect that children in this age range generally prefer to look at more than one of a thing. We can't, it's no more than that. Now, these time course plots are consistent with the idea that children aren't using plural morphology to identify the appropriate referent, but we did a bit of confirmatory hypothesis testing just to be sure. So for this, we constructed a linear mixed effects model for each of the eye tracking studies. We predict the increase in target looking for each child. That is the proportion of target looks during the interval of interest minus the proportion of target looks in the preceding interval. And we're going to do that according to these fixed effects and their interactions. these per subject random effects, and these per item random effects. When we look at the results, we find that the 95% confidence intervals for the intercept overlap with 0 in both studies, suggesting that children are not switching to the target. The null effect of target means that it doesn't matter if it's a singular or a plural referent. We further find null effects of novelty, voicing, and animacy. One interaction reaches significance in study 1, that of novelty and voicing, such that children look less towards novel voice targets. We really don't have any interpretation for this. This happened, but altogether, this null result, these intercepts crossing 0, suggests that we find no evidence of receptive knowledge of the plural, and that's consistent with several previous studies, at least for younger kids in especially 23 to 25 or 23 to 26 months. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to the production task. So in this task, caregivers read a storybook presented on an iPad that prompts children to supply familiar or novel singulars and plurals. So in effect, this is a 21st century version of the WUG task. The book consists of 16 two-page singular/plural test sequences for singular then plural. On the first page, the caregiver says something like, "Look, a knop. Can you say knop?" and waits for a response. On the second page, the caregiver asks, for example, "What's on the couch?" Under the classic WUG task, so unlike the classic WUG task, we record the response on both the singular and the plural page. And note that we have no syntactic cues to plurality on the test pages. And we're going to record both the caregiver and child for offline coding. So to give you an example of what the storybook is like, I want to play a video. On the left is what is on the iPad screen, including the prompt to the parent written in the upper left corner. Note that this is an older kid, so they're actually going to skip ahead over some of the parents' prompts. They've gotten further into the experiment and have figured out what the structure is. But the child, you'll note, is producing singulars and plurals appropriate for the prompts. Okay, this is playing here.
Look, a star.
Star
Yeah.
on a couch.
A star on a couch.
Two stars on the couch.
Okay. Look, a tep. Can you say tep?
Tap in the house.
Okay, and I just wanted to preemptively answer a question that I fielded on this video before. I wanted to note that we're not actually doing any eye tracking during the production task. So the kid here still has an eye tracking target on his head. That's what various listeners to previous versions of this talk have noticed. That's that little black and white target. It's still there because, as we found out, the kids really don't want to give up the sticker, and it's just easier to let them keep it on their heads for the duration of the production task, because they go directly from the eye tracking task into the production task.
Look, a star.
Okay. So we coded the responses offline into 4 categories. So no response / not relevant, singular, non-conventional plural like dog, dog, or two dog, and plural. I've plotted the response counts as well as the number of unique children with each response type according to trial type, that is singular versus plural, and object novelty, whether it's a familiar object or a novel object. And differences between production scores were not, and because differences between production scores were not significantly, because the differences weren't significant across these 2 studies, we collapsed and analyzed them together. Okay, in this data, there are 5 things that I want to note. First, we see a decreasing proportion of non-responses with age. That is, the green boxes along the top get smaller. Kids are getting better at saying things. Second, we see a small number of plural responses on singular trials. Kids will, very interestingly, sometimes provide a plural in cases where we expect a singular, especially for certain familiar items that seem to be more common in the plural. Third, we see a peak in non-conventional plural marking. That is usually something like a number plus a singular noun, 2 wug, around 30 months. And we see an increasing usage of the plural with age. And this is higher for familiar than for novel object words. Also, we see at least some novel plurals in every age interval, including the earliest. So even though these kids aren't showing robust receptive knowledge, we are finding some plurals in their speech. In the interest of time, I'm going to just skip this slide. And okay, So then we need to do some confirmatory hypothesis testing. So to evaluate the effects of novelty, voicing, and animacy on production, while accounting for the variability at the level of participants and items, we fit two Bayesian logistic mixed effects models predicting, two Bayesian logistic mixed effects models predicting expressive success. Including one model predicting when children supply singular responses to singular trials, and one predicting when children supply plural responses on plural trials. The plural model, I should note, is limited to trials where a child succeeds on the preceding singular trial, hence the two different models. We're modeling a separate set of trials. And a negative, this reveals a positive intercept for singular trials, that is, children typically succeed on the singular trials, and a negative intercept on plural trials. Children typically fail to supply a plural on those plural trials, but they do a fair amount of the time. A negative coefficient for novelty for the plural models indicates that children are less likely to supply a novel plural than a familiar plural. Any omitted interactions here were not significant. So now that we have receptive knowledge as measured by the eye-tracking task and expressive knowledge as measured by the storybook task, we can look at the correlation between these two measures across kids. And we find a correlation very near zero between these two measures, suggesting that children who use the plural in their own speech are no more likely to look towards the appropriate referent in our comprehension task. So the results of these first two studies suggest that kids between 24 and 36 months are occasionally producing the plural, including novel plurals, but aren't looking towards appropriate reference when they're named in a comprehension task. So in a single design with a single set of kids, we've reproduced that odd pattern of results that we saw integrating across several corpus studies, parental vocabulary report, and in-lab comprehension studies. We see some production, but no strong evidence of comprehension. But then the question is, can we recover performance if we add some additional cues regarding number? And this is one of the key predictions of that structure first learning account that I proposed earlier on. Kids can't use the little S and Z plural markers in order to detect the systematic marking of the plural, but perhaps they can use other words in the utterance to infer grammatical number, learn a productive plus S or plus Z rule for their own speech, and then over time come to recognize word final S's and Z's as in the speech of others as markers for the plural. Thus, what we do in the third and final experiment is include other words in the spoken prompt that are cues to the number of the referent, as in, look, there are two knobs. When both where both the copular R and the quantifier to help to identify the appropriate reference. So even if I don't give you the noun there, you should be able to look towards the appropriate side of the screen. So of course, right when we started to run, right when we had this ready to run in the lab, the global pandemic shut everything down, including obviously in-lab data collection. And not knowing how long this circumstance would last, and also out of a personal interest in web-based experiments for reaching broader participant populations, we turned to MIT's Look It project. So this this service provides infrastructure for running at-home web experiments with children. That is, we have both the parent and the child sit in front of a computer with a camera, and they do the experiment as presented in JavaScript. So our experimental design translates fairly easily. The disadvantage compared to doing this in the lab is that we need to do manual frame-by-frame gaze coding. That is whether the child is looking to the left or the right of the screen in a given video frame. So you can sort of like think about in Zoom, whether you can tell whether someone's looking to the left or the right. That's essentially what we have to, that's what we have to code. That's the raw data that we have for gaze tracking. This ends up being terribly time consuming, but at least it has meant that we've been able to proceed with data collection since last summer. So in Look At, the presented stimuli and trial orderings are the same as what we used in the lab, but we are going to be limited to written and video instructions to parents. One other note is that we don't have precise synchrony between presented video events and the recorded videos that we get back from the family. We get differences between those two that are consistently less than 500 milliseconds and usually less than 50 milliseconds. But there's really no way to get precise timings as to when two different video streams start and stop. That's just not something that JavaScript can actually reach in and pull in that data. So this precision is enough for us to check for a general switch to the target referent, but it's not precise enough for us to characterize the exact timeline. For example, we can't do reaction time analyses. Okay, so the results for this, for all kids in study 3, we run the same sort of Bayesian linear regression on the corrected proportion of target looking, and nothing is significant. This shows that children between 24 and 36 months are still at chance in looking to the appropriate referent. Everything is null. I'm not even going to show it. It's so boring. But then we tried subsetting to what we called high producers, or kids who are supplying the plurals on more than 50% of trials. And in fact, we tried this before, but it showed nothing for the previous studies. Remember that completely flat plot that I had before of productive versus expressive, expressive versus receptive language knowledge. And here we finally see some evidence of comprehension. We see a strong shift, especially in looks to the plural in this set of high producers. Though, as I said, we can't be sure of the exact timing because of this on look-at. And this is actually proven to be a bit of a challenge for confirmatory hypothesis testing because we can't neatly partition into before versus after the presentation of the disambiguating stimuli, that is the presentation of the agreement cues. So I don't have a nice Bayesian regression to show you yet, but I want to let you know we're working on replicating this in the lab as with pre-registration. So some children, those who are producing the most plurals, seem to show some evidence of comprehension, but only when we add back the agreement cues. So integrating across all 3 studies, children indeed seem to be producing plural nouns before they are able to reliably recognize them in speech from adults. So the one exception is that we see some apparent comprehension from kids if both they show strong productive performance and we present them with other agreement cues in the stimuli, like the numerical quantifier, 1 or 2, the numbers 1 or 2, and a copular verb that encodes grammatical number. So this pattern of results is hard to explain under a bottom-up associative account of morphosyntax learning, where children shouldn't need to rely on syntactic agreement cues in order to comprehend the plural. And so I proposed an alternative account, which I'm calling structure-first learning, in which children infer local regularities in the grammar first, discover the accompanying semantic distinctions, make these generalizations such that they're able to use the plural in their own speech, and then finally learn the full extent of the phonological distinctions, which are necessary to understand the plural in the speech of others. Now, I want to make clear that we don't have conclusive evidence for all the parts of that big cascade of learning, right, proposed by that account. But at least we want to open the discussion, especially with this audience, that an associative account of morphosyntax learning doesn't seem to work, and that it really fails to, and just on the basis of theory, it fails to take advantage of the sort of rich supervisory signals that children might be able to discover from broader language structure. So the invitation to speak here today made special note to emphasize ongoing and future research directions. So let me say a few words on that. As I mentioned earlier, we're working on modeling plural productivity by extending the model of determiner usage that Roger talked about earlier. This work is ongoing, but there are 2 major elaborations with respect to the determiner work. First, we want to be able to treat grammatical number as a latent feature, and that the model should be able to learn what other words in the utterance, what reference in the context, and plural markings on the noun are all related to that one latent feature, that is grammatical number. Second, we want a model that can capture 2 different aspects of children's linguistic behavior that have been treated separately so far. That is a model of when children choose to inflect, as well as how they choose to inflect. That is, when do they use a regular versus an irregular inflection, goose versus geese. But there are actually 2 other projects that I want to mention, in part because I'm presenting talks on both of them next week at CogSci and would love for you all to join. So first, one thing that we noticed in, oops, sorry, I skipped ahead here. Okay. First, one thing that we found in some background corpus analyses was that the corpus annotators very often attributed plural noun usage to kids when the actual phonological transcription didn't support it. And so we started to think about this as a feature of adult listeners rather than a methodological bug. That is, adults, including parents, should act as noisy channel listeners to recover or even impose meanings on children's noisy speech. So we spun out a separate project characterizing how adults recognize and interpret children's speech. And as it turns out, adults are quite aggressive, noisy channel listeners, and we can model this with a fine-tuned version of BERT. Second, we started to think more carefully about how plural morphology interacts with polysemy, that is, where words sustain multiple meanings. Another way to say this is that morphological plurals are not always the same as semantic plurals. A simple example of this is that the word glasses sustains a meaning as eyewear that the singular glass does not. But as a preliminary step, before we get into thinking about how word meanings interact with the sort of structure induction, we have this preliminary step where we need to estimate the prevalence of these sort of polysemous or homonymous terms in speech to children. So how common do we see these sort of situations like glass versus glasses? So we actually have some interesting results on that. With that, I want to conclude, and I want to thank the 2 labs involved in this work. And also thanks to our funding source, the US National Institutes of Health. And I want to thank the many participating families. A special thanks to the Leipzig Lectures on Language organizers for inviting us to present today. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. And I'm going to leave up this overview slide with a link to the CogSci paper from last year. And with that, I think we'll open it up for questions. Maybe I need to stop sharing though. Let's see. Should I stop sharing for the question session?
Yes, please. At the moment, it might be better. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot for your great presentations to both of you. Very happy to have you here today, and I'm very happy for giving the audience the possibility to ask questions to Stefan and Roger. So who has any question? Okay, so Matteo has a question, so I'm sure you might want to use your microphone, right?
Yes. So thank you both for the really interesting talk. I was wondering, I mean, by design, if I got it correctly, you need to use pseudo words to avoid that the children have previous experience with the words or the singulars and plurals. I was wondering whether it might be, in a sense, more difficult for a child to apply maybe his or her grammatic knowledge to a pseudo word, because, for example, I mean, of course, they are familiarized with an op, that is this object, but for real words, maybe the reference to the actual object and the fact that, for example, these two are two hands, not one object, singular, made of 2 parts, is a knowledge that they might acquire with repeated exposure, even visual, and maybe for them it might be a bit more difficult to apply this on a concept that they have been introduced to just, I mean, maybe 1 hour before or just before the test phase.
I can handle that. Absolutely, that is a concern. So I think we can further break it down into 2 pieces. One, that there's a memory component that the kid has to remember. So in the production tasks that I presented, and this goes back through the WUG task of Berko 1958. The kid has to remember whatever this new lexical item, whatever this new noun that was introduced is. The second part is that it might have some sort of consonant. It's the first time they're using their mouth to say that word, and so had they said those particular consonants before, they seem to, in some cases, find that tiresome and choose not to say anything. So there's definitely a component of whether children are willing to participate at all, given the increased difficulty. So in light of that, it's really sort of it's stunning to see how good they are at novel production. So what we see from the productive side, from the storybook task, is that in fact we see lots of evidence that they're using the novel form. So it's probably somewhat suppressed by the factors that you're describing, that you bring up. But nonetheless, we see this evidence that they have some sort of combinatorial knowledge.
Yeah, I was wondering whether, for example, like in an ideal experiment, we have like this puppet that we call a wug, for example, and you give the wug to the kid and the parents, and they have this wug at home. Like the kid sees it. They don't talk about it, but they see. So the kid is, in a sense, familiar. So also maybe I was wondering whether like we might like the capacities might be a bit underestimated. They might be even better if they have, if you want, a semantic experience, but not a grammatical experience with the concept of a wug or nop or something like that. Yeah.
There is actually there is a longitudinal experimental design that I know, let's see, by Jennifer Zaff and Linda Smith from the mid-2000s, where they actually did a longitudinal test of kids' knowledge. And so they're not actually sending an object home, but at least they're controlling the input over, I think it was 8 successive sessions. And in fact, that study found the earliest production of productive plural morphology. So this is totally a possibility. So it does seem like there's some sort of combinatorial stuff happening on the production side from early on. The question is, how is that informing the comprehension side, and how, in some cases, does it seem to not be informing the comprehension side?
All right, thanks a lot. I think, Patrick, you have a question as well. You posted one in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Geza. Thank you both for your talks. Yeah, I just have a very naive question. So when you, for Stefan, when you mentioned that in the storybook elicitation results, the children sometimes provide plural responses in singular trials, right? I was just wondering, yeah, basically, what does that mean? Like, do you have any explanation or guess what this could be? I mean, could this be like a task effect that kind of, some of the kids at least figure out that this is a game they're playing where they have to provide plurals, or, you know, what is going on, or what's your guess or explanation?
So we can't rule out that there's something happening task-wise, that they just sort of get in the rhythm of supplying plurals, alternating with singulars, and then they mess that up at some point. But actually, there's a little, I mean, it's anecdata at this point. We really don't have enough to be able to say anything conclusive, but there's an interesting coincidence that of the 6 instances that we've seen, 4 have been on one lexical item, 4 have been on stars. So when they're presented with a single star, the kids yell stars. And before the parents, so one thing, like I showed in that one video, once the kids get into the task and they see that this is naming objects, and naming one of an object, naming 2 of an object, then if they know the word, then they're just going to go ahead and shout it out at the beginning, especially if they're older than about 30 months. And so we see a number of kids who shout out stars in response to the singular star. And looking at, so I didn't show this today, but we actually have some corpus analyses looking at the relative frequencies of singulars versus plurals across various lexical items. This is sort of analogous to the a flew versus the flew example that Roger showed for item specific experience. Stars is one that in fact is much more common in the plural than in the singular. Sorry, not that much more common, slightly more common. It's not the same as, for example, pants. But it is sufficiently more common that it seems like it's possible that is the lexical item that kids are learning, and that over time this knowledge of plural is going to help them also figure out that there's a singular, right? So it's not necessarily that you start with a singular base case and develop a plural after that, but instead there might be something where they need to discriminate both of these, and that connects nicely with just some typological, like cross-linguistic typological stuff, that you actually see systems, you see morphological systems where there isn't that, they're not nearly as privileged. The singular is not nearly as privileged. So Welsh is a good example. So I think I'd really love to get more data on this, but it's something that we sort of see rarely right now, too rarely to really do any sort of principled analysis.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Thanks a lot. Are there any other questions? Sorry. So if not, I might have an additional question, because, and maybe it's really naive, and maybe you also even said something about that, but I'm still puzzled by the fact that this is so against what we normally see in language development with production and comprehension. And I was actually wondering whether the comprehension is still not really tackled by the task that you use, because we know this from theory of mind development, so explicit, implicit task in theory of mind, and it really shows different developmental patterns in children, right? So if we have implicit theory of mind tasks, they show abilities a lot earlier than they show with explicit theory of mind tasks. And I was actually wondering that whether this could be related to that, or asked differently, why plural the other way around? What makes plural so special? This would be, this is something that what keeps me thinking the whole time, basically.
So there's definitely the possibility that there are task-based issues. We need to run additional experiments to sort of dismiss every possible alternative. I want to respond though to the first point of having a sort of strong prior expectation that comprehension comes before production. I want to contrast this with the case of second language acquisition, where at least I, as a second language learner, have found myself in this situation all the time, that I can recognize a certain word used by certain people, and I can build some sort of abstractions over that. I know that, oh, that is the plural form of that for certain words. But then being able to hear and recognize that from a host of new speakers in a host of new phonological contexts with things on either side, then that receptive task is actually a lot harder. So when we say receptive task, when we're saying like language comprehension, we're sort of collapsing over both of those, and we're not allowing for this possibility that learners could be able to recognize these parts of the linguistic signal in certain parts. And build abstractions, build generalizations, build combinatorial language knowledge on top of that, but then still not have enough knowledge, especially of the specifics of phonology, to be able to recognize it in all the different cases. And this is very, very hard to test. This makes it very hard to test, but at least this is some possibility whereby you get this sort of iteration between hearing enough to be able to form a rule, but then using that rule to hear yet more.
All right, thanks a lot. It's true. Yeah, thanks. Are there any other questions from the audience? That does not, that does not seem to be the case. Then I have some final general question, one for you, Roger, and one for you, Stefan. So I would like to ask the question to the senior researcher first. And the question is, what is the most important challenge for the field for the next 5 years, let's say?
That's a great question. Do you want it to be just 5? Can I widen the question?
If you want to have 10 years, I would give you 10.
I'm actually going to widen the question, and I'm going to just sort of make a gesture at a much bigger thing that we're facing. So what we can ask the question, like, what is the most time sensitive thing that we face as a field? And I think my view is that the most time, that is, what is the work that we should start to think about doing now that we haven't been doing, that we may not be able to do ever in the future if we don't do it now or as soon as possible, which is that there are thousands of languages in the world, and our mission as a science is to understand the principles that govern all of them, and both of the commonalities and the variations. But half to 90% of those languages may disappear within our lifetimes, and we have to figure out simultaneously ways of making use of the data that are available from the large majority of languages, from languages around the world, both the fact that those data are scarce and that it's not going to be possible forever to collect them, but also to figure out what to do with them. And so the simultaneous dovetailing, we talked today entirely about case studies that are in English. But of course, there's a great wealth of variety in languages around the world, in their structures and in the cultures and in the context of acquisition and of language use. And bringing together these advances in data and methods with the diversity and richness of language and the human experience, I think is something that we didn't talk about at all today, but I think that we all need to have on the horizon. And so one thing that I'm starting to think a lot about is what can we do with data from many different languages? How should we think about data collection? Because also the work that we're doing here actually helps, I think, push forward our thinking about the kinds of theoretical questions we can ask and should be asking, and also what kind of data will speak to those theoretical questions. And how do we dovetail that with the on-the-ground challenges of actually answering those questions for languages around the world? So the sort of this advance of turning our theoretical frameworks into precise, quantifiable, computationally implementable models that can be interfaced with data, together with the richness and wealth and scarcity of the data, I think to me is the biggest challenge for the field, not just for 5 years or for 10 years, but for our lifetimes.
Thanks a lot. I think 5 years are not allowed. I guess the question was asked too late when considering that a lot of languages actually are going to vanish. Yeah. So the next question is for the junior researcher, and I would really like to ask you, how can junior researchers contribute to solving this challenge?
Well, so for that specific one, I actually know remarkably little. So though I did my PhD at Berkeley, I did it in the psychology department rather than the linguistics department. And so although the linguistics department there is sort of the epicenter of North American language documentation and attempts to really flesh this out, I actually, that's actually a space that I know very little about. I think one thing that junior researchers can do, however, is commit to using the data that comes out of these sort of efforts, and specifically commit to work that is robust across typological diversity. Again, this talk being a perfect counterexample to that, where I spoke, and the entire thing was both Roger's and mine was all about English. That leaves open questions as to the generalizability of the models that we're proposing. So we need to not do that as junior researchers, and we need to move towards analyses that are sort of necessarily cross-linguistic.
All right. We would really love to thank you for your great presentations and for your interesting input to the community in terms of language development and things like that. So thanks a lot for being here today. And yeah, we were really happy being able to host you. So I would also like to thank everyone else who was here today via Zoom, YouTube, and it leaves me to say that we will see us again after the summer break with a talk by Giulio De Gano. I'm not quite sure, maybe someone can help me out after that, and Nali Golestani, who will give their presentation after the summer break here with us in the Leipzig lectures on language. So thanks a lot for your for coming and for your attention, and thanks a lot for your presentations again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.